I gave everything for that family. Everything. And this is how they repay me? Silence. The jury has rendered its verdict. You have been found guilty on all counts. On the evening of September 14th, 2023, in an affluent neighborhood of Portland, Oregon, emergency services received a frantic 911 call that would expose one of the most disturbing cases of family violence the Pacific Northwest had ever witnessed. Behind the manicured hedges and picture-perfect exterior of a colonial-style home on Lakewood Drive, 3 bodies lay in pools of blood, victims of a rampage that would challenge everything investigators thought they knew about who could commit such unspeakable acts. The victims were 38-year-old Rachel Thornton, a successful pediatric nurse, and her 2 sons, 9-year-old Mason and 6-year-old Tyler. They had been bludgeoned to death with a heavy brass candlestick from their own dining room, their bodies discovered by Rachel's husband, David, when he returned from a business trip to Seattle. The responding officers, veterans of the Portland Police Bureau with decades of combined experience, later testified that the crime scene haunted them, unlike anything they had encountered before. The violence had been savage and personal. Rachel bore the heaviest injuries, with evidence suggesting she had been struck repeatedly even after she had stopped moving. The boys were found in their shared bedroom, huddled together in the corner, defensive wounds on their small arms indicating they had tried to protect themselves from someone they likely knew and trusted. What made this case particularly shocking wasn't just its brutality, but the identity of the person who would eventually be charged with these murders. 71-year-old Eleanor Prescott, Rachel's mother-in-law, and the beloved grandmother of Mason and Tyler. Before we explore the depths of this chilling case, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. If you find this investigation compelling, please consider subscribing for more in-depth true crime analysis. The story of Eleanor Prescott would become one of Oregon's most disturbing examples of hidden family violence, shattering assumptions about elderly perpetrators and revealing the toxic dynamics that can fester beneath the surface of seemingly picture-perfect families. Detective Carmen Vasquez, a 17-year veteran of the Portland Police Bureau's Major Crimes Division, was the first senior investigator to arrive at 847 Lakewood Drive. Her body camera footage, which would later become pivotal evidence at trial, captured her initial encounter with Eleanor Prescott, who sat in the family room on an antique settee, her hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea that a uniformed officer had prepared for her. "I was supposed to come for dinner tonight," Eleanor told Detective Vasquez, her voice remarkably composed given the circumstances. "David called me from his business trip yesterday and asked if I could check on Rachel and the boys. She hadn't been answering her phone, and he was worried. So I came over this afternoon to see if everything was all right." Eleanor paused, lifting the teacup to her lips with hands that showed the slightest tremor. "When no one answered the door, I used my emergency key. David insisted I have one, for the grandchildren, you understand. And when I walked in," she closed her eyes, shaking her head slowly, "I found them, my beautiful grandsons, my daughter-in-law, just gone."
Detective Vasquez's training immediately flagged several inconsistencies. Eleanor's emotional presentation seemed disconnected from the horror she claimed to have witnessed. Her description of the scene was clinical and detached, lacking the raw devastation one would expect from a grandmother who had discovered her grandchildren murdered. Neighbors had already begun gathering outside, several mentioning to patrol officers that Eleanor had been a frequent visitor to the Thornton home, sometimes welcome, sometimes not. One neighbor, Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, stated she had witnessed increasingly heated exchanges between Eleanor and Rachel over the past several months, particularly regarding how the children were being raised. As crime scene technicians began processing the house, Detective Vasquez received crucial information from her partner, who had been canvassing the surrounding properties. The house 2 doors down had a security system with exterior cameras that captured a portion of the Thornton driveway, and the homeowner, a retired IT professional named Harold Chen, had already pulled the relevant footage. The video would become the foundation of the prosecution's case. It clearly showed Eleanor Prescott's silver Lexus arriving at the Thornton residence at 2:47 p.m. More than 3 hours before she claimed to have discovered the bodies and called 911 at 6:12 p.m. More importantly, Rachel's minivan was visible in the driveway when Eleanor arrived, contradicting her statement that she had come to check on an empty house. When confronted with this discrepancy later that evening at the Portland Police Bureau headquarters, Eleanor's demeanor underwent a startling transformation. The composed, genteel grandmother was replaced by a defensive, combative woman who insisted the camera timestamps must be incorrect, that technology was unreliable, that she was being targeted because of her age. Her alibi crumbled further when investigators reviewed her credit card records, which showed a purchase at a garden center 15 minutes from her home at 1:30 p.m., placing her in the area well before her claimed arrival time. Cell tower data confirmed her phone had been within range of the Thornton residence from 2:43 p.m. onward, never leaving until after the 911 call. The investigation accelerated as detectives uncovered the complex family dynamics that had been building toward this tragedy for years. David Thornton, 40, Eleanor's only surviving child, her daughter having died in infancy decades earlier, was traveling for his pharmaceutical sales position when the murders occurred. His alibi was ironclad: flight records, hotel check-in timestamps, and a dinner meeting with clients in Seattle that lasted until 10 p.m., all confirmed by multiple independent sources. When David received the news, he collapsed in the lobby of his Seattle hotel. Paramedics had to administer oxygen before he was coherent enough to speak with detectives. His shock appeared genuine, and investigators initially considered him only as a potential source of information about the family's dynamics. Text messages recovered from Rachel's phone revealed household in crisis. Over the past 8 months, Rachel had been documenting Eleanor's increasingly controlling behavior, sending messages to her sister expressing fear and frustration. She showed up again today without calling first. One message read from 6 weeks before the murders. Completely reorganized the boys' playroom because she didn't like how I had arranged it. When I asked her to please respect our space, she told me I was ungrateful and that she had every right to be involved in how her grandsons were being raised. David just says to let it go, that she means well. I can't keep living like this. The medical examiner's preliminary report painted a picture of extreme violence. Rachel had sustained 14 blunt force trauma wounds, primarily to her head and upper body, with defensive injuries on her forearms, indicating she had fought desperately to protect herself. Mason had suffered 8 wounds, and Tyler had received 6, both boys attacked in their bedroom where they had apparently fled during or after the assault on their mother. The report noted that the injuries to Rachel showed signs of overkill, violence that continued well beyond what was necessary to cause death, suggesting an attack driven by intense personal emotion rather than calculated intent to simply eliminate a threat.
Blood evidence analysis indicated the attack had begun in the kitchen, where Rachel appeared to have been preparing an afternoon snack for the boys. Sliced apples and peanut butter were found on the counter, a half-filled juice box on the table. The attack then moved through the hallway and into the living room, where Rachel's body was ultimately found, before the assailant proceeded upstairs to the boys' bedroom. Mason's body was discovered in front of his younger brother, positioned as though he had tried to shield Tyler from the attacker. This detail, when presented in court, would cause several jurors to weep openly. Portland police arrested Eleanor Prescott on September 16, 2023, charging her with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community, with local media struggling to reconcile the image of the well-dressed, well-spoken grandmother with the savage nature of the crimes. The Multnomah County District Attorney's Office announced they would seek life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, Oregon having abolished the death penalty. Prosecutor Nathan Reyes cited the particularly heinous nature of the crimes and the vulnerability of the child victims as factors warranting the maximum possible sentence. Eleanor's court-appointed attorney, Michelle O'Coffer, immediately began constructing a defense centered on her client's age, her lack of criminal history, and what she would characterize as the physical impossibility of a 71-year-old woman overpowering a healthy 38-year-old and two active young boys. Public fascination with the case exploded as details emerged about Eleanor's background. She had been a respected elementary school principal before retirement, active in her Episcopal church, and known throughout her community as a devoted grandmother who attended every soccer game, school play, and birthday party for Mason and Tyler. Yet as investigators dug deeper, a more complex picture emerged. Former teachers who had worked under Eleanor's administration described her as exacting and controlling, someone who demanded absolute adherence to her vision and could be ruthlessly vindictive toward those who challenged her authority. She presented herself as this warm, nurturing educator, one former teacher told investigators, speaking on condition of anonymity. But if you crossed her, if you disagreed with her publicly or made her look bad in any way, she would systematically make your life miserable. She drove 3 teachers to resign in my time there, all without ever doing anything that could be definitively proven as harassment. Another former colleague recalled Eleanor's response when a parent complained about her handling of a disciplinary matter. She smiled and was perfectly pleasant to that mother's face, but within a month she had documented every minor infraction by that family's children and found reasons to suspend both kids for things that other students did without consequence. She called it consistent application of school policy, but everyone knew it was retaliation. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors built their case around the security footage, physical evidence found at the scene, and the powerful motive: Eleanor's determination to maintain control over her grandsons and punish Rachel for attempting to establish boundaries. The murder weapon, a heavy brass candlestick from the Thornton dining room set, was recovered from a storm drain 3 blocks from the Prescott residence. Eleanor's fingerprints were found on the base, along with DNA consistent with all 3 victims. Hair fibers matching Eleanor's distinctive silver-gray hair were found clutched in Rachel's hand, evidence that the victim had struggled with her attacker. Community vigils for Rachel, Mason, and Tyler drew hundreds of participants. Rachel's colleagues from Emmanuel Children's Hospital established a memorial fund in her name to support pediatric nursing scholarships. Mason's 3rd-grade class created a memory book filled with drawings and messages, while Tyler's kindergarten planted a tree in the school courtyard with a small plaque bearing his name. The case became a focal point for discussions about elder-perpetrated family violence and the often overlooked warning signs of controlling behavior in family relationships. Domestic violence advocates pointed to the case as an example of how abusive dynamics could exist outside traditional spousal relationships and how society's reluctance to view elderly women as capable of violence could allow dangerous situations to escalate. As the trial date approached, national media attention intensified with true crime podcasts and cable news programs featuring experts who debated Eleanor's psychological profile and the family dynamics that had led to such a devastating outcome. The question that captivated public interest wasn't simply whether Eleanor had committed the murders, the evidence pointing to her guilt was substantial, but rather how a woman who had spent her career dedicated to children's education and welfare could have killed her own grandchildren. The Multnomah County Courthouse stood against the gray October sky as pretrial hearings for the state of Oregon versus Eleanor Prescott commenced approximately 6 weeks after the murders. Security had been enhanced in response to the case's high profile, with additional screening at entrances and a designated media area to manage the intense press interest.
Inside courtroom 3A, Judge Marcus Thompson presided with the careful neutrality that had defined his 22 years on the bench. His reputation for running fair, efficient proceedings made him well-suited for a case that promised unprecedented media scrutiny and public emotion. The prosecution team, led by Deputy District Attorney Nathan Reyes, arrived with extensive documentation and a clear strategy focused on the security camera footage and physical evidence that would form the cornerstone of their case against the elderly defendant. Defense attorney Michelle O'Coffer entered alongside her client, Eleanor Prescott, who appeared in court wearing a modest gray cardigan over a white blouse, her silver hair carefully styled, projecting an image of dignified elderly womanhood that seemed calculated to appeal to potential jurors' preconceptions about grandmothers.
The state intends to prove beyond reasonable doubt that the defendant, despite her age and cultivated appearance, deliberately and with premeditation murdered Rachel Thornton and her two young sons, Mason and Tyler. Reyes stated during the hearing on admissible evidence, "We will demonstrate that Mrs. Prescott had the means, the opportunity, and a powerful motive. Her obsessive need to control her son's family and her determination to punish Rachel Thornton for daring to establish boundaries that would limit Mrs. Prescott's access to and influence over her grandsons." The courtroom remained silent as Reyes outlined how the prosecution would present evidence of Eleanor's escalating hostility toward Rachel in the months leading up to the murders, including witness testimony from friends, family members, and neighbors who had observed the deteriorating relationship between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. Judge Thompson listened attentively, occasionally making notes on his legal pad, his expression giving no indication of his thoughts on the prosecution's planned approach. Defense attorney Okafor rose deliberately for the defense's response, her measured demeanor contrasting with Reyes's more energetic presentation. "Your Honor, the defense intends to demonstrate that it would have been physically impossible for Mrs. Prescott, a 71-year-old woman with arthritis in her hands and a recent hip replacement, to overpower a healthy 38-year-old woman and inflict the severity of wounds described in the medical examiner's report," Okafor argued. "Furthermore, we will present evidence suggesting that someone else had both the motive and opportunity to commit these terrible crimes, and that investigators rushed to judgment against Mrs. Prescott based on circumstantial evidence and ageist assumptions about her capabilities." This statement caused a murmur in the gallery, with several members of Rachel's family audibly reacting. Rachel's mother, Janet Kim, shook her head in visible disgust at the defense's strategy, while Rachel's sister, Dr. Grace Kim, wrapped an arm around her mother's shoulders. One of the most contentious issues during the pretrial hearings involved the admissibility of text messages between Rachel and her sister Grace, in which Rachel had expressed growing fear of her mother-in-law. The messages, sent over the course of several months, painted a disturbing picture of escalating intimidation. Eleanor came over while David was at work yesterday. She stood in my kitchen telling me I was raising her grandsons wrong, that I was too permissive, that I was damaging them. When I asked her to leave, she said, "This isn't your family, Rachel. It's mine. You're just the woman David happened to marry." Another message, sent just 10 days before the murders, read, "I told David we need to talk about limiting his mother's visits. He said he'd handle it, but I know he won't. He never stands up to her. I'm scared, Grace. There's something in her eyes when she looks at me now, like she's measuring me for a coffin." The defense fought vigorously to exclude these messages as hearsay, while the prosecution argued they fell under the state of mind exception, demonstrating Rachel's fear and the escalating tensions preceding the murders. After extensive arguments from both sides, Judge Thompson ruled the messages admissible, stating they provided critical context for understanding the family dynamics and the victim's state of mind. This decision was a significant victory for the prosecution and a visible setback for the defense team. Another crucial pretrial battle centered on the murder weapon, the brass candlestick that had been found in a storm drain with tissue and blood evidence linking it to all three victims. The defense moved to suppress this evidence, claiming that the officer who had initially located the weapon had failed to follow proper evidence collection protocols, potentially compromising the chain of custody. The prosecution countered with testimony from the forensic team supervisor who had overseen the collection, explaining that while initial discovery had been made by a patrol officer, forensic technicians had properly documented and collected the evidence within minutes, maintaining its integrity for DNA and fingerprint analysis. Judge Thompson denied the motion to suppress, ruling that any procedural irregularities went to the weight of the evidence rather than its admissibility. Another significant win for the prosecution. The question of Eleanor's mental competency became a central focus during the third day of pretrial hearings, when the defense introduced a geriatric psychiatrist, Dr. Naomi Silverstein, who testified that the defendant showed signs of mild cognitive impairment consistent with early-stage vascular dementia. While Eleanor can understand the charges against her and assist in her defense, her capacity to have formed the specific intent necessary for first-degree murder may have been compromised by these cognitive changes, Dr. Silverstein stated. The prosecution immediately requested and was granted permission for their own expert examination, resulting in contradictory testimony from forensic psychiatrist Dr. William Chen, who found no significant cognitive impairment. Mrs. Prescott demonstrates excellent recall of events, strategic thinking during our evaluation sessions, and clear understanding of the implications of various legal strategies, Dr. Chen testified. While some minor age-related changes are present, as would be expected in any person her age, there is no impairment that would affect her understanding of her actions or their consequences. Perhaps the most emotional moment of the pretrial proceedings came when David Thornton was called to testify about his mother's relationship with his wife. David entered the courtroom looking hollow, his once robust frame diminished by grief and stress. He took the witness stand without looking at his mother, his hands visibly shaking as he was sworn in. My mother and Rachel had a difficult relationship from the beginning. Mom always had strong opinions about how things should be done. When we first got married, it was little things, how Rachel decorated our apartment, what she cooked for dinner when Mom visited. I thought it would get better when we had kids, but it got worse. David described how Eleanor had become increasingly possessive of Mason and Tyler, criticizing Rachel's parenting decisions, showing up unannounced to check on the boys, and undermining Rachel's authority when she thought David wasn't paying attention. Rachel came to me about 2 months before it happened, David continued, his voice cracking at times. She said she wanted to limit Mom's visits, maybe set up a schedule instead of letting her just drop by whenever she wanted. She said Mom made her feel like a guest in her own home, like she was being watched and judged constantly. As David continued his testimony, Eleanor's expression hardened visibly, her earlier appearance of frail grandmotherly concern replaced by flashes of something colder. Several people in the gallery later reported noticing the change in her demeanor. I should have listened to Rachel, David said, finally looking toward the prosecution table where photos of his wife and sons had been placed. I kept telling her Mom meant well, that she was just adjusting to not being the center of my life anymore. I made excuses for her. I minimized what Rachel was telling me, and now... He couldn't finish the sentence. Judge Thompson called for a brief recess to allow the witness to compose himself. The prosecution methodically built their timeline during these hearings, presenting evidence that would form the backbone of their case. Security camera footage from a neighboring property showed Eleanor Prescott's vehicle arriving at the Thornton residence at 2:47 p.m. on September 14, 2023. Rachel's fitness tracker recorded her returning home with the boys from school pickup at 2:15 p.m., where she remained until her heart rate data abruptly ended at 3:24 p.m., a time consistent with the medical examiner's estimated time of death. A delivery driver for a local pharmacy reported seeing an older woman matching Eleanor's description leaving the Thornton home at approximately 5:45 p.m., walking briskly toward a silver sedan parked in the driveway. Eleanor's 911 call came at 6:12 p.m., when she claimed to have just arrived and discovered the bodies, directly contradicting both the security camera footage showing her arrival more than 3 hours earlier and the delivery driver's observation. The defense team worked to establish alternative theories during cross-examination of the state's witnesses, suggesting the possibility of a home invasion or random attack, and at one point obliquely implying that David himself might have had motive to harm his family. Detective Vasquez firmly refuted these theories during her testimony, pointing out that nothing had been stolen from the home, there were no signs of forced entry, and David's alibi had been verified through multiple independent sources, including flight records, hotel check-in data, client meeting records, and cell tower information, placing him in Seattle throughout the relevant time frame. When the defense suggested Eleanor lacked the physical strength to commit such violent acts, Detective Vasquez countered that forensic evidence, including the angle and depth of wounds, was consistent with an attacker of Eleanor's height and build. She also noted that adrenaline during highly emotional states could temporarily provide elderly individuals with capabilities beyond their normal strength. As the pretrial hearings concluded, Judge Thompson ruled on several motions and established strict guidelines.
As the pretrial hearings concluded, Judge Thompson ruled on several motions and established strict guidelines for media coverage of the trial, allowing pool cameras in the courtroom but prohibiting live streaming and requiring a 30-minute delay on any broadcast to allow for potential redactions. The jury selection process was scheduled to begin the following week, with extensive questionnaires designed to identify potential biases regarding age, family dynamics, and the ability to convict an elderly defendant of violent crimes against children. The community remained deeply divided as the trial approached. Some expressed sympathy for Eleanor, based solely on her age and appearance, finding it impossible to reconcile the image of a grandmother with the brutality of the alleged crimes. Others, particularly those who had known Rachel and her boys, demanded justice regardless of the defendant's demographics. Local religious leaders called for calm and compassion for all affected, recognizing the unique tragedy of a case where both the alleged perpetrator and victims were members of the same family. David Thornton's position remained perhaps the most heart-wrenching aspect of the case. Having lost his wife and sons, apparently at the hands of his own mother, he was observed sitting alone during court recesses, approached by neither legal team, a man stranded between impossible grief and impossible betrayal. Media coverage intensified as jury selection began, with national news programs featuring segments on the case and legal analysts debating the strength of the prosecution's evidence versus the challenges of convicting an elderly grandmother. Court TV positioned their team in Portland, broadcasting daily updates and hosting panels of experts discussing the psychological dimensions of the case and the patterns of controlling behavior that domestic violence specialists had identified in Eleanor's documented interactions with Rachel. The question that seemed to captivate public interest most was not whether Eleanor Prescott had committed the murders. The evidence appeared substantial, but how a woman who had dedicated her career to children's education could suddenly commit such horrific violence against her own grandchildren. As the final pretrial hearing concluded, Judge Thompson addressed both legal teams directly. This case will undoubtedly evoke strong emotions, but this courtroom demands factual evidence and logical arguments, not appeals to sympathy or prejudice from either side. His words set the tone for what would become one of the most closely watched trials in Oregon history, a case that would challenge assumptions about family violence and force society to confront the uncomfortable reality that sometimes the greatest danger comes from those we would least expect.
The trial of Eleanor Prescott was scheduled to begin on November 6, 2023, with the prosecution announcing they were fully prepared to present their case against the grandmother accused of one of the most shocking family massacres in the Pacific Northwest's recent history. The morning of November 6, 2023, brought the first autumn storms to Portland, rain streaking the windows of the Multnomah County Courthouse as spectators lined up before dawn, hoping to secure one of the limited public seats. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with subdued tension as the 12 jurors and 4 alternates filed in, their faces solemn with the weight of the responsibility they now carried. Judge Marcus Thompson began proceedings promptly at 9 a.m., his voice clear and authoritative as he instructed the jurors on their duties and the presumption of innocence that must guide their consideration of evidence. Eleanor Prescott sat at the defense table dressed in a conservative navy blue suit, her silver hair impeccably styled, her posture straight but not rigid. She had exchanged the cardigan and soft blouse of her earlier appearances for a more formal presentation, still projecting refinement, but now with an edge of the professional authority she had commanded as a school principal. David Thornton sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, his face a mask of controlled grief, flanked by Rachel's mother Janet and sister Grace, who had traveled from California for every day of the trial.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a case about control. And what happens when someone who has built her entire identity around control encounters a situation she cannot manipulate? Prosecutor Nathan Reyes began his opening statement standing directly before the jury box, making deliberate eye contact with each member as he spoke. The evidence will show that the defendant, Eleanor Prescott, a 71-year-old retired school principal, a woman who cultivated an image of refined, caring grandmother, made a calculated decision to end 3 innocent lives rather than accept that her daughter-in-law had the right to establish boundaries in her own home. Reyes's voice remained measured as he outlined the timeline the prosecution would establish, using a large display screen to show key evidence. You will see with your own eyes security camera footage showing Eleanor Prescott arriving at the Thornton home at 2:47 p.m., when Rachel and her sons were already home from school. You will hear how she remained in that house for more than 3 hours before calling 911 at 6:12 p.m., claiming to have just discovered the bodies, a lie that launched her attempted cover-up. Reyes guided the jury through what they would learn in the coming days, describing how the prosecution would establish motive through text messages, emails, and witness testimony showing Eleanor's escalating campaign of control and intimidation against Rachel. You will hear from David Thornton himself how his mother increasingly interfered in their marriage, how she belittled and undermined Rachel, how she treated her grandsons as her possessions rather than independent human beings with their own mother. You will hear how Eleanor became enraged when she learned Rachel had finally persuaded David to establish formal boundaries on her visits, limits that Eleanor viewed not as reasonable accommodation, but as an act of war. As Reyes detailed the forensic evidence, the murder weapon bearing Eleanor's fingerprints and DNA, blood spatter analysis indicating she was present during the attacks, the medical examiner's findings showing the extreme brutality of the bludgeoning, several jurors visibly paled. The state does not take lightly the prosecution of a 71-year-old woman for triple murder, Reyes concluded, his tone grave. But the evidence will show that age does not diminish capacity for violence, nor should it shield someone from accountability for the premeditated murder of a mother and her 2 young sons. Defense attorney Michelle O'Coffer approached the jury with measured steps, her opening statement beginning with an acknowledgement of the tragedy. The deaths of Rachel Thornton and her sons Mason and Tyler represent a loss beyond words. Nothing said in this courtroom can diminish the horror of what happened in that house or the grief that David Thornton and the Kim family continue to endure. She paused, her gaze moving across the jury. However, compounding one tragedy with another, the wrongful conviction of an innocent woman will not bring justice to anyone. O'Coffer methodically challenged the prosecution's timeline, suggesting that while Eleanor may have arrived at the home earlier than she initially stated to police, this discrepancy stemmed from the shock and trauma of discovering her family murdered, not from guilt. The prosecution would have you believe that a 71-year-old woman with arthritic hands and a hip replacement performed 15 months ago, standing 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighing 125 pounds, somehow overpowered a healthy 38-year-old woman, and then pursued and attacked 2 active young boys who would have fled in terror, O'Coffer said, her tone questioning. O'Coffer introduced the defense's alternative theory that an unknown intruder had committed the murders, possibly someone connected to the Thornton home through Rachel's work at the hospital or through one of the various service providers who had access to the neighborhood. The prosecution has tunnel vision, focusing solely on Mrs. Prescott while ignoring other viable possibilities that fit the evidence, she argued. When this trial concludes, you will be left with reasonable doubt, substantial doubt about Mrs. Prescott's involvement in these terrible crimes. As O'Coffer returned to the defense table, Eleanor reached for her attorney's hand in apparent gratitude, a gesture that seemed choreographed to reinforce her grandmotherly image to the jury. Judge Thompson instructed the prosecution to call their first witness, and Detective Carmen Vasquez took the stand, her 17 years of homicide investigation experience evident in her composed, professional demeanor. I arrived at 847 Lakewood Drive at approximately 6:35 p.m. on September 14, 2023, responding to a 911 call reporting multiple deceased persons. The defendant, Eleanor Prescott, was seated in the family room when I arrived, appearing calm and composed despite her claim to have just discovered her daughter-in-law and grandchildren murdered. Detective Vasquez described her initial observations and the incongruities that had immediately raised her suspicions. What struck me most was the disconnect between what Mrs. Prescott claimed to have experienced and how she presented. She provided detailed descriptions of the positions of the bodies and specific injuries before I had shared any such information with her. When I asked how she knew these details, she became flustered and said she must have noticed them when she checked for pulses. The prosecution then introduced the security camera footage from the Chen residence, which showed Eleanor's vehicle arriving at the Thornton home more than 3 hours before her 911 call. This footage shows the defendant's silver Lexus LS pulling into the Thornton driveway at 2:47 p.m., when Rachel Thornton and her minivan was already visible in the driveway, and her fitness tracker data confirms she and the boys had arrived home from school approximately 30 minutes earlier. The footage continued, showing no activity until approximately 5:43 p.m., when Eleanor could be seen exiting through the front door, walking to her vehicle, appearing to place something in the trunk, then returning to the house. At 5:47 p.m., we see the defendant exit the house again and drive away. Her vehicle returns at 6:08 p.m., 4 minutes before the 911 call. During this 25-minute gap, security footage from a gas station 3 blocks away shows her vehicle passing, and a traffic camera captures her car traveling north towards her own residence and then returning. Reyes played the 911 call next, the courtroom falling silent as Eleanor's voice filled the space. "I need help, please. I just came to check on my daughter-in-law and grandchildren. My son asked me to, and I found... Oh God, they're dead. There's blood everywhere. Please send someone quickly." The dispatcher asked if she was certain they were deceased. Eleanor responded, "Yes, I checked. I have first aid training from my years in education. There's no pulse on any of them. Please, please hurry." Reyes directed the detective to address the discrepancy between Eleanor's statement that she had just came to check on the family and the security footage showing her arrival more than 3 hours earlier. During cross-examination, defense attorney Michelle Okafor challenged Detective Vasquez on various aspects of the investigation. "Detective, isn't it possible that Mrs. Prescott, upon discovering her murdered family members, went into shock, which affected her ability to accurately recall the timeline of events?" Vasquez acknowledged this was theoretically possible, but noted that shock typically creates confusion, not the fabrication of an alternative narrative with consistent details. Okafor continued, "And isn't it possible that someone else could have entered the house through a back entrance, committed these crimes, and left before Mrs. Prescott discovered what had happened during her visit?" Vasquez acknowledged this theoretical possibility, but pointed out there were no signs of forced entry at any entrance, that Eleanor's presence during...
Detective Vasquez acknowledged this theoretical possibility, but pointed out there were no signs of forced entry at any entrance, that Eleanor's presence during the entire time frame when the medical examiner determined the murders occurred made an unknown assailant highly unlikely, and that fiber evidence from Eleanor's clothing had been found at the crime scene. As the first day of testimony concluded, the prosecution called Harold Chen, the neighbor who owned the security camera, to authenticate the footage and provide context for what had been captured. "I've had that system for 3 years, and I review the footage regularly because we've had package thefts in the neighborhood," Chen testified. "The timestamps are accurate. I synchronize them with atomic time monthly. When the detective asked if I had footage from that day, I pulled it immediately, and what I saw made me sick to my stomach." Chen explained that he had witnessed Eleanor visiting the Thornton home frequently over the months prior, sometimes multiple times per week. "There were times I noticed Mrs. Prescott's car would arrive shortly after Rachel left for work, and she would still be there when Rachel returned with the boys in the afternoon. Other times I saw what looked like arguments at the front door, Rachel standing in the doorway, clearly not inviting Mrs. Prescott in, and Mrs. Prescott gesturing and appearing upset." Defense attorney Okafor's cross-examination challenged the reliability of residential security cameras and questioned whether Chen could be certain about what he had observed from a distance. "Mr. Chen, you testified you saw what looked like arguments, but you couldn't hear what was being said, could you? Isn't it possible these were simply animated conversations between family members?" Chen conceded he couldn't hear the conversations, but maintained his observations about body language were accurate. The afternoon session continued with testimony from the first responding officers, who described finding Eleanor Prescott seated in the family room, appearing composed despite the horrific scene throughout the house. Officer Jessica Torres testified, "When I asked Mrs. Prescott if she had touched anything in the house, she said she had checked for pulses on all 3 victims, but hadn't disturbed anything else. However, I observed that her clothing had what appeared to be blood transfer stains that were inconsistent with simply checking pulses. Crime scene technician Raymond Okonkwo followed, presenting evidence that luminol testing had revealed extensive blood cleanup attempts in the kitchen sink and first-floor bathroom. Someone had made significant efforts to wash blood from their hands and possibly their face. We found diluted blood in the sink drains, on towels in the bathroom trash, and trace evidence suggesting someone had attempted to clean blood from hard surfaces before we arrived. Judge Thompson adjourned court at 4:30 p.m., instructing jurors to avoid media coverage or discussions about the case before the next day's proceedings. As the courtroom emptied, David Thornton sat alone long after others had left, eventually approached by a victim advocate, who spoke quietly with him before escorting him out through a private exit to avoid the press gathered outside. Eleanor Prescott was led away by court security officers, her earlier composed demeanor unchanged despite the damaging testimony presented. Legal observers noted that her lack of visible emotional response to discussions of her murdered grandchildren continued to present an image problem that her defense team had not adequately addressed. The first day had established the prosecution's narrative clearly. Eleanor Prescott had been present during the murders, had lied about her timeline, and had attempted to clean up evidence afterward. It was a damning beginning to a trial that would only grow more disturbing as it progressed. The second day of trial began with the prosecution continuing to build their case through forensic evidence, calling the Portland Police Bureau's chief forensic analyst, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, to the stand. Dr. Tanaka, with 18 years of experience in forensic crime scene analysis, presented detailed findings about blood distribution patterns found throughout the Thornton home, using three-dimensional reconstruction software to create a visual representation for the jury. The blood evidence tells a clear chronological story of how these attacks unfolded, she explained, indicating various areas on the digital model. The initial assault on Rachel Thornton began in the kitchen near the island where she was preparing a snack for her sons. Impact spatter on the cabinets and refrigerator indicates she was struck multiple times while standing, then again after she had fallen to the floor. The analyst continued, walking the jury through the sequence as revealed by the physical evidence. Rachel Thornton then attempted to flee toward the front of the house. Blood transfer on the hallway wall indicates she braced herself while wounded, moving toward the living room where she ultimately collapsed. The concentration of blood around the couch area indicates this is where she received the majority of her injuries. The forensic expert's deadpan description painted a vivid picture of Rachel's desperate final moments. The attack then moved upstairs to the boys' bedroom. Blood evidence indicates Mason Thornton was struck multiple times near the bedroom door, suggesting he may have been trying to protect his brother or block the attacker's path. Tyler Thornton's injuries occurred in the corner of the room near the closet, where he appears to have been trying to hide. The forensic expert then addressed the blood evidence on Eleanor Prescott's clothing. The defendant's clothing, collected as evidence, showed multiple types of blood staining. Transfer stains on her sleeves and torso are consistent with contact with bloodied victims. However, more significantly, we found impact spatter on her blouse and jacket, small droplets that occur when blood is in motion, specifically during blunt force trauma. This type of spatter could not have resulted from simply checking victims for signs of life. Prosecutor Reyes directed Dr. Tanaka to explain the significance of these findings. Impact spatter of this type occurs when blood is expelled from a wound during an active assault. The pattern on Mrs. Prescott's clothing is consistent with someone standing in close proximity to a victim within 2 to 3 feet while blunt force trauma was being inflicted. This is not consistent with her claim that she simply discovered the bodies and checked for pulses.
She continued, visibly distressed by the memory. Then I heard Rachel scream, not an angry scream, a terrified scream. And then sounds I can't adequately describe, thumping sounds, more screaming but weaker. And then children crying and screaming upstairs. I could tell because sound carries differently from the second floor. Dr. Okonkwo explained why she hadn't called police at that moment. It went quiet so quickly. The whole thing, from the first raised voices to silence, was maybe 5 minutes, maybe less. I thought perhaps they'd had a family argument that got out of hand, that someone had fallen or something had broken. I told myself I was overreacting. I will regret that decision for the rest of my life. During cross-examination, Okafor questioned the neighbor's certainty about what she had heard. Dr. Okonkwo, you testified you couldn't make out specific words. Is it possible you misinterpreted normal family sounds as something more sinister? The veterinarian shook her head firmly. I've lived next to families with children for 20 years. I know the difference between children playing loudly and children screaming in terror. What I heard that afternoon was absolute fear. The day's final witness was Portland police officer Marcus Williams, who had discovered the murder weapon during a systematic search of the surrounding area. Following standard protocol for evidence recovery, we searched in expanding circles from both the crime scene and the defendant's residence, Officer Williams testified. In a storm drain approximately 3 blocks from Mrs. Prescott's home, along what would be a logical driving route between the two locations, I discovered a brass candlestick wrapped in a blood-stained cloth napkin. Williams described how the storm drain had been partially covered by autumn leaves, suggesting the items had been placed there recently, consistent with the September 14th timeline. The prosecution used this testimony to introduce traffic camera footage from an intersection between the Thornton home and Eleanor's residence, captured at 5:51 p.m. on the day of the murders. This footage shows the defendant's silver Lexus traveling north toward her residence approximately 4 minutes after the security camera showed her leaving the Thornton home, Detective Vasquez explained when recalled briefly to authenticate the footage. The timing is consistent with someone making a brief stop to dispose of evidence before continuing home. As Judge Thompson adjourned court for the day, the weight of the evidence presented was evident on the faces of the jurors. The prosecution had established not only that Eleanor Prescott was physically present during the time frame of the murders, but had attempted to clean up blood evidence, had disposed of the murder weapon, and had created a false narrative about discovering the bodies. Outside the courthouse, legal analysts for the Evening News noted the strength of the prosecution's case. What we saw today was a methodical dismantling of any alternative explanation for Eleanor Prescott's presence at that house. The blood evidence, the fingerprints on the murder weapon, the cleanup attempts, the disposal of evidence. This is not the behavior of someone who stumbled upon a crime scene. This is the behavior of someone trying to cover their tracks. The third day of trial began with unprecedented security measures, as word had spread that David Thornton would testify against his mother. The tension in courtroom 3A was palpable as spectators and media prepared for what promised to be the most emotionally wrenching testimony of the proceedings. David Thornton entered looking gaunt, the vibrant pharmaceutical sales representative replaced by a hollow-eyed figure in an ill-fitting suit that hung on his diminished frame. He took the witness stand without looking toward the defense table where his mother sat, his hands visibly trembling as he was sworn in. Prosecutor Reyes approached his witness with evident care, aware of David's impossible position. Mr. Thornton, I know this testimony is extremely difficult. Before we discuss the events leading up to September 14th, could you tell the jury about your relationship with your mother growing up? David took a steadying breath before answering. My mother was present, always present. She had strong opinions about everything, what I wore, who my friends were, what activities I pursued. I thought it was normal, that all mothers were like that. It wasn't until I was older that I realized not everyone's mother read their diary or called their friends' parents to verify where they were, or showed up at their college dorm unannounced to inspect their room. David described how Mom's controlling nature had evolved over the years. When I started dating Rachel, Mom didn't approve.
She said Rachel was too independent, that she wouldn't be easy to manage. Looking back, I think that's exactly why I was drawn to Rachel. She didn't take orders, didn't defer to everyone else's opinions. She had her own mind. He paused, his voice catching. Mom made things difficult from the start. She criticized Rachel constantly, her cooking, her housekeeping, her career choice. Nothing Rachel did was ever good enough. Reyes guided David to discuss how Eleanor's behavior escalated after the births of Mason and Tyler. When Mason was born, something shifted in my mother. Suddenly she had a new focus, a new person to mold, I guess. She was at our house constantly, giving Rachel instructions on feeding schedules, sleep training, everything. Rachel felt like a babysitter in her own home while Mom played mother to our son. David described specific incidents of Eleanor undermining Rachel's parenting. Rachel would set a rule, say, no dessert before dinner, and Mom would wait until Rachel wasn't looking and give Mason cookies anyway. Then she'd wink at him and say, our little secret. She was teaching our children to deceive their mother, and when Rachel confronted her about it, Mom would say Rachel was being controlling and paranoid. The testimony grew more difficult as David addressed the months leading up to the murders. Things got really bad after Tyler started kindergarten this fall. Mom had fewer excuses to be at our house all day, and she didn't take it well. She started showing up during Rachel's shifts at the hospital, letting herself in while the boys were at school, rearranging things, Rachel's closet, the kitchen cabinets, the boys' rooms. Rachel would come home and find everything different, with notes from Mom explaining how her way was more efficient. David's voice dropped as he continued. I should have listened to Rachel. She told me it felt like an invasion, like Mom was marking territory, showing that she could enter our home whenever she wanted, and we couldn't stop her. I made excuses. I said Mom was just lonely, that she meant well, that Rachel was overreacting. He finally looked toward the defense table, where Eleanor sat with an unreadable expression. I was wrong. Rachel was right about everything. Prosecutor Reyes asked David about the conversation that had set the final events in motion. About 3 weeks before it happened, Rachel sat me down and said she couldn't live like this anymore. She said Mom's behavior was affecting her mental health and the boys were picking up on the tension. She asked me to talk to Mom about limiting her visits, a scheduled time like every other Sunday when she could come for lunch and spend a few hours with the boys. How did you respond? Reyes asked. I agreed. I was terrified of telling Mom, but Rachel was right. She had been right for years, and I had been too much of a coward to face it. So I called Mom and explained that we needed some structure around her visits. How did your mother react? David's expression tightened. She was furious. She accused Rachel of turning me against her, of poisoning the boys against their grandmother. She said Rachel was jealous of her relationship with Mason and Tyler. She said she wouldn't allow some woman to cut her off from her grandchildren. Did you take that statement as a threat? I didn't at the time. I thought she was just upset and would calm down, but Rachel did. Rachel said Mom looked at her now like she wanted her dead. David's composure finally broke at this point, and Judge Thompson called for a brief recess. When testimony resumed, Reyes moved to the day of the murders. Mr. Thornton, can you tell us about your communications with your mother on September 14th? She called me that morning while I was at the airport waiting for my flight to Seattle. She asked if I was really going on this trip, leaving Rachel alone with the boys. I said yes, it was a work obligation. She said she might stop by to check on them while I was gone. What was your response? David closed his eyes. I told her that would be fine. I thought if she could just have a normal visit, see the boys, maybe things would settle down. Rachel didn't know I'd given her permission to stop by. I didn't tell her because I knew she'd be upset. The weight of this admission hung in the courtroom. David's attempt at peacekeeping had set the stage for tragedy. Mr. Thornton, have you spoken with your mother since her arrest? I visited her once, about a week after. I needed to understand. I asked her why. She wouldn't answer directly. She kept talking about how Rachel had tried to take her grandsons away, how she'd been pushed to the breaking point. She said she remembered going to the house, she remembered arguing with Rachel, and then everything was confused.
Did she express remorse for the deaths of Mason and Tyler? David's face contorted with grief and rage. No. She expressed frustration about her situation, the jail conditions, the publicity, how this was affecting her reputation. When I asked specifically about the boys, she said she couldn't remember that part clearly. She said it must have been an accident, that she never would have intentionally hurt them. But she didn't deny being there. No, she couldn't. She knew about the evidence. Defense attorney Okafor approached cross-examination with evident caution, aware that aggressive questioning of a grieving husband and son could alienate the jury. Mr. Thornton, I'm deeply sorry for your loss, and I appreciate how difficult this testimony must be. I have just a few questions. She established that David had not witnessed any of the events of September 14th, that his knowledge came from investigators and evidence presented in court rather than first-hand observation. In your entire life, had you ever seen your mother physically violent with anyone? David considered the question. She never hit me, if that's what you mean, but there was a violence in her words sometimes, in the way she could cut someone down, or make them feel worthless. And there was an incident when I was in middle school. A teacher she felt had treated me unfairly. She went to the school, and I heard later she had to be escorted out by security. She was screaming, threatening. It scared me. This testimony, intended by the defense to show lack of physical violence, instead reinforced the prosecution's portrait of Eleanor as someone capable of extreme behavior when crossed. Okafor quickly concluded her questioning, perhaps recognizing she had inadvertently strengthened the prosecution's case. The prosecution next called Grace Kim, Rachel's younger sister, who provided insight into Rachel's final weeks. Rachel called me almost every day that last month, Grace testified, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her eyes. Rachel was exhausted, not physically, emotionally. She said it felt like she was fighting a war on two fronts, trying to maintain her boundaries with Eleanor while also trying to save her marriage because David kept taking his mother's side. Grace described conversations that revealed Rachel's growing fear. About 2 weeks before she died, Rachel told me she'd found Eleanor in her kitchen when she came home from work, just standing there in the dark, waiting for her. Eleanor said she'd come to talk, but the way Rachel described it, she said Eleanor looked at her with pure hatred. She said Eleanor told her, "You may have turned my son against me, but you will not keep me from those boys. I've handled problems bigger than you." Prosecutor Reyes asked how Rachel had responded to this incident. She was shaken. She'd always known Eleanor was difficult, but this felt different. She said Eleanor's eyes were wrong, like she wasn't quite there anymore. Rachel was going to talk to David about changing the locks, getting a security system, maybe talking to a lawyer about what options they had to keep Eleanor away. Did Rachel ever express fear of physical violence? Grace nodded, wiping her eyes. The last time we talked, the morning of the day she died, Rachel said she was afraid of what Eleanor might do when she realized the limited visits were really going to happen. She said, "Grace, I don't think she's just going to accept this. I've never seen her accept not getting what she wants. And what she wants are those boys." Grace's testimony concluded with her describing learning of the deaths. "My mother called me. I was at work, and I saw her number and almost didn't answer because I was busy. Then I had this feeling. I don't know how to describe it. I answered, and she couldn't speak at first. Just crying. When she finally got the words out, I collapsed. Right there in my office, they had to call an ambulance because I couldn't breathe." Defense attorney Okafor's cross-examination was brief, establishing only that Grace had not witnessed any incidents between Eleanor and Rachel firsthand,
and that her testimony was based on Rachel's characterizations of events. Miss Kim, isn't it possible that your sister, who by your own account was exhausted and stressed, may have been interpreting Eleanor's behavior in the most negative possible light? Grace's response was fierce. My sister was the most balanced, thoughtful person I've ever known. She worked with children. She understood behavior. She understood difficult personalities. If Rachel was afraid of Eleanor Prescott, there was a reason to be afraid. And my sister and nephews are dead, which suggests Rachel's fears were completely justified. The prosecution concluded their case with testimony from Dr. Helena Okonkwo, a forensic psychologist specializing in family violence and controlling behavior patterns. In my 30 years studying family dynamics and domestic violence patterns, I've identified consistent patterns in individuals who exercise extreme control over family members. These patterns include a sense of entitlement to family relationships, boundary violations that increase in frequency and severity, an inability to accept autonomy in family members, and what we call ownership thinking, the belief that family members, particularly children, are possessions rather than independent individuals. Without specifically diagnosing Eleanor, whom she had not personally evaluated, Dr. Okonkwo noted the documented behaviors, unannounced entries to the home, reorganization of belongings, undermining parental authority, escalating when boundaries were proposed, aligned with high-risk patterns she had observed in other cases of family violence. When individuals with these patterns face what they perceive as a loss of control or access to family members, particularly grandchildren they feel entitled to, the resulting psychological crisis can trigger extreme responses that seem disproportionate to outside observers but make complete sense within the individual's distorted worldview.
Okafor's cross-examination challenged the application of Dr. Okonkwo's general research to this specific case. Doctor, haven't you just described controlling behavior that many grandparents exhibit without ever becoming violent? The psychologist agreed that most controlling grandparents don't become violent, but emphasized context. You're correct that controlling behavior alone doesn't predict violence. However, when we see escalating intrusions despite requests to stop, explicit or implicit threats when boundaries are proposed, and preoccupation with consequences and battles, we enter higher risk territory. The documented communications in this case, combined with the deliberate nature of the confrontation on September 14th, suggest someone who had moved from controlling behavior into active threat. With Dr. Okonkwo's testimony complete, Prosecutor Reyes rose to address the court. Your Honor, the state rests. Judge Thompson called for a lunch recess before the defense would begin presenting their case. As spectators filed out for the break, the overwhelming nature of the prosecution's evidence was evident. Physical evidence, digital communications, expert analysis, and witness testimony had established not only Eleanor Prescott's presence during the murders, but the psychological foundation and escalating dynamics that had led to violence. Legal commentators observed that the defense faced an uphill battle. Their alternative perpetrator theory had been effectively dismantled by the lack of forced entry, Eleanor's documented presence throughout the relevant time frame, and the personal nature of the attack patterns. Their frail elderly woman narrative had been contradicted by forensic evidence about the weapon's mechanical advantage and expert testimony about adrenaline-fueled capabilities. The question now was whether Eleanor Prescott would take the stand in her own defense, a high-risk decision given the substantial evidence against her, but potentially necessary if the defense had any hope of creating reasonable doubt. The defense opened their case on the afternoon of the third day by calling Dr. Margaret Sullivan, a geriatric neurologist who had examined Eleanor Prescott while she was awaiting trial. I conducted a comprehensive neurological evaluation of Mrs. Prescott, including cognitive testing, brain imaging, and review of her medical history, Dr. Sullivan testified. My findings indicate moderate vascular changes in the frontal lobes, consistent with early cerebrovascular disease, which can affect executive function, impulse control, and emotional regulation. Defense attorney Okafor guided Dr. Sullivan through an explanation of how such changes might affect an elderly person's behavior. Patients with frontal lobe vascular changes often demonstrate what we call disinhibition, a reduced ability to control impulses they would have previously managed. They may also show personality changes, becoming more rigid, more irritable, and less able to adapt to changing circumstances or accept outcomes that differ from their expectations. In your professional opinion, could such changes contribute to an explosive, violent reaction in someone with no prior history of physical violence? Okafor asked. In cases where there's a pre-existing pattern of controlling behavior or difficulty managing frustration, cerebrovascular changes can lower the threshold for violent outbursts. The individual may react with disproportionate intensity to triggers that previously would have caused merely anger or frustration. During cross-examination, Prosecutor Reyes challenged the timing and implications of Dr. Sullivan's findings. Doctor, you first examined Mrs. Prescott approximately 2 months after her arrest. Isn't it true that symptoms you're describing could be exaggerated by someone facing serious criminal charges? Dr. Sullivan acknowledged this possibility, but defended her methodology, citing validated testing protocols designed to detect malingering. Reyes then presented records from Eleanor's primary care physician showing no documented concerns about cognitive changes in examinations conducted in the months before the murders. Dr. Sullivan, if Mrs. Prescott was experiencing significant frontal lobe impairment affecting impulse control, wouldn't we expect to see some documentation of behavioral changes or cognitive concerns from her regular physician? The neurologist conceded that typically some signs would be noticed, though she suggested subtle changes might not appear in routine examinations. Reyes pressed further, and even accepting your diagnosis, doesn't vascular cerebrovascular disease typically affect cognitive function gradually? Wouldn't Mrs. Prescott have been aware of her diminishing impulse control and therefore responsible for managing it? The neurologist reluctantly acknowledged that patients with early-stage vascular changes typically retain awareness of their condition and the ability to seek help or remove themselves from triggering situations. The defense next called Dr. Richard Okonkwo, a forensic pathologist who had reviewed the medical examiner's findings without conducting his own examination of the victims. Based on my review of the autopsy reports and wound documentation, I have concerns about some of the conclusions drawn regarding the force required to inflict these injuries. He suggested that the fracture patterns could indicate a longer assault with less force per blow, rather than a concentrated attack requiring significant strength. An elderly individual with limited strength could potentially cause these injuries over an extended period, perhaps 15 to 20 minutes, striking with moderate force multiple times, whereas the medical examiner's analysis assumes a more concentrated attack. Prosecutor Reyes' cross-examination was incisive. Dr. Okonkwo, you never examined the victims' bodies yourself, correct? When confirmed, Reyes continued, and you're suggesting that Mrs. Prescott may have slowly bludgeoned her daughter-in-law and grandchildren over a period of 15 to 20 minutes? Doesn't that scenario actually suggest even greater premeditation and determination than the prosecution has alleged? The defense expert appeared uncomfortable as he acknowledged that an extended attack wouldn't support an impulsive, momentary loss of control. He said, I was simply noting that the injuries could be consistent with different time frames, but the damage to the defense's narrative had been done. The courtroom fell silent when defense attorney Okafor announced her next witness. The defense calls Eleanor Prescott. Eleanor made her way to the witness stand slowly, her movements careful but not labored, notably more natural than the exaggerated frailty she had displayed during earlier appearances. She wore a simple gray dress with a pearl necklace, projecting an image of dignified, elderly womanhood. Once sworn in, Eleanor sat with perfect posture,
her hands folded in her lap, her expression one of composed grief that contrasted sharply with the brutal crimes she was accused of committing. Eleanor guided Okafor through her version of events on September 14, 2023. David had called me the day before and mentioned he was concerned about Rachel. He said she seemed stressed, overwhelmed with the boys and her work. He asked if I might check in on her while he was in Seattle, just see if she needed any help. I was happy to help. Despite what's been suggested in this courtroom, I loved Rachel. She was the mother of my grandchildren. I wanted our relationship to improve. Can you tell us what happened when you arrived at the house that afternoon? I got there around 2:45. Rachel's car was in the driveway, so I knew she was home. I rang the doorbell, but no one answered. I thought perhaps she was in the backyard with the boys, so I used my key. David had given it to me years ago for emergencies, and let myself in to look for her. Eleanor's account continued, her voice steady but emotional. The house was quiet when I came in. I called out for Rachel, for the boys, but there was no answer. I walked through the living room, and that's when I saw Rachel on the floor. Blood everywhere. She closed her eyes, shaking her head slowly, but observers noted her makeup remained largely undisturbed. I don't remember clearly what happened next. I think I went back downstairs. I was in shock, complete shock. I remember washing my hands at some point because they had blood on them from checking for pulses. I don't know how long I sat there before I finally called 911.
Okafor addressed the timeline discrepancy directly. Mrs. Prescott, the prosecution has presented evidence that you arrived at the house much earlier than you initially told police. Can you explain this? Eleanor nodded slowly. I know the times don't match what I said that first night, but you have to understand, I had just found my family murdered. I wasn't thinking clearly. I couldn't keep track of time. I may have arrived earlier than I remembered. I honestly don't know. Everything from that afternoon is fragmented in my memory. What about the security footage that shows you leaving the house at 5:43 p.m. and returning at 6:08 p.m.? Eleanor hesitated before answering. I must have left at some point. I think I went to my car to get my phone. I couldn't find it inside. I may have driven somewhere. I'm not sure. Like I said, I wasn't in my right mind. Everything was confused. Okafor asked about the murder weapon found in the storm drain. I didn't put that candlestick in any storm drain, Eleanor said firmly. I don't know how it got there. Maybe whoever really did this disposed of it. I certainly didn't. And your fingerprints on the weapon? That candlestick sat on the dining room mantel for years. I gave it to David and Rachel as a wedding gift. I've handled it dozens of times over the years, dusting it, moving it when I helped clean for holidays. My fingerprints being on it means nothing. Throughout her testimony, Eleanor maintained her innocence while acknowledging her presence at the house, attributing her inconsistent statements to trauma and shock rather than attempted cover-up. When Okafor concluded her direct examination, Prosecutor Reyes approached the witness stand for cross-examination. Mrs. Prescott, you've testified that you were in shock, that your memory is fragmented, that you can't clearly recall your actions that afternoon. Yet you've provided quite specific details about certain things, checking pulses, calling out names, going upstairs. How do you explain this selective clarity? Eleanor appeared flustered for the first time. I remember some things clearly and others not at all. That's what trauma does. It doesn't affect memory uniformly. I see. So you clearly remember checking pulses, but you can't remember driving to a storm drain and disposing of a murder weapon. I didn't dispose of any weapon. Reyes shifted tactics, displaying the text messages and communications presented earlier in the trial. Mrs. Prescott, you sent a message to your son stating that Rachel doesn't know who she's dealing with and that some battles have consequences she can't imagine. What did you mean by that? Eleanor's composure flickened. I was frustrated. I was venting to my son about feeling excluded from my grandchildren's lives. I didn't mean anything threatening by it. And your internet search for how long does it take to die from head trauma, 2 days before Rachel and your grandchildren died from head trauma, was that also just frustration? Eleanor's attorney objected to the characterization, but Judge Thompson overruled, directing the witness to answer. I don't recall making that search. Perhaps it was something I saw in the news or a program I was watching. I certainly wasn't planning to harm anyone. Reyes walked Eleanor through the timeline established by evidence, highlighting each discrepancy between her statements and the documented facts. You arrived at 2:47 p.m. Rachel's fitness tracker recorded her heart stopping at 3:24 p.m. Yet you claim you found everyone already dead when you arrived and then sat in shock for over 2 hours before calling 911. Is that your testimony? Eleanor's voice tightened. I've told you I don't remember the timeline clearly. I was traumatized. But you do remember that you found them already dead? You're certain about that detail? Yes. Then how do you explain the blood spatter on your clothing that forensic experts testified could only have been created during an active assault, while injuries were being inflicted? Eleanor's response was barely audible. I don't know. Perhaps I may have touched them more than I remember, tried to help them somehow. Reyes pressed further. Mrs. Prescott, the forensic pathologist testified that Rachel Thornton suffered 14 blunt force trauma wounds. Someone struck her 14 times with that candlestick. Mason suffered 8 wounds. Tyler suffered 6. That's 28 separate strikes. How does someone checking pulses end up covered in impact spatter from 28 separate blows? Eleanor's composure crumbled visibly. I don't know. I don't remember everything that happened. It's all confused. Is it possible, Mrs. Prescott, that you remember more than you're telling this jury? That you remember being angry at Rachel for trying to limit your access to your grandchildren? That you remember confronting her in her kitchen, picking up that candlestick, and... No, I didn't. I would never hurt those boys. They were my grandchildren, my blood. Rachel was the problem, not them. She was the one trying to take them away from me. The courtroom went silent. Eleanor seemed to realize what she had just said, implicitly acknowledging Rachel as the problem while distancing herself from responsibility for the children's deaths. When Reyes concluded his direct examination, Prosecutor Reyes approached the witness stand for cross-examination. Mrs. Prescott, you've testified that you were in shock, that your memory is fragmented, that you can't clearly recall your actions that afternoon. Yet you've provided quite specific details about certain things, checking pulses, calling out names, going upstairs. How do you explain this selective clarity? Eleanor appeared flustered for the first time. I remember some things clearly and others not at all. That's what trauma does. It doesn't affect memory uniformly. I see. So you clearly remember checking pulses, but you can't remember driving to a storm drain and disposing of a murder weapon. I didn't dispose of any weapon. Reyes shifted tactics, displaying the text messages and communications presented earlier in the trial. Mrs. Prescott, you sent a message to your son stating that Rachel doesn't know who she's dealing with and that some battles have consequences she can't imagine. What did you mean by that? I was frustrated. I was venting to my son about feeling excluded from my grandchildren's lives. I didn't mean anything threatening by it. And your internet search for how long does it take to die from head trauma, 2 days before Rachel and your grandchildren died from head trauma, was that also just frustration? Eleanor's attorney objected to the characterization, but Judge Thompson overruled, directing the witness to answer. I don't recall making that search.
Perhaps it was something I saw in the news or a program I was watching. I certainly wasn't planning to harm anyone. Reyes walked Eleanor through the timeline established by evidence, highlighting each discrepancy between her statements and the documented facts. You arrived at 2:47 p.m. Rachel's fitness tracker recorded her heart stopping at 3:24 p.m. Yet you claim you found everyone already dead when you arrived and then sat in shock for over 2 hours before calling 911. Is that your testimony? Eleanor's voice tightened. I've told you I don't remember the timeline clearly. I was traumatized. But you do remember that you found them already dead. You're certain about that detail? Yes. Then how do you explain the blood spatter on your clothing that forensic experts testified could only have been created during an active assault while injuries were being inflicted? Eleanor's response was barely audible. I don't know. Perhaps I may have touched them more than I remember, tried to help them somehow. Reyes pressed further. Mrs. Prescott, the forensic pathologist testified that Rachel Thornton suffered 14 blunt force trauma wounds. Someone struck her 14 times with that candlestick. Mason suffered 8 wounds. Tyler suffered 6. That's 28 separate strikes. How does someone checking pulses end up covered in impact spatter from 28 separate blows? Eleanor's composure crumbled visibly. I don't know. I don't remember everything that happened. It's all confused. Is it possible, Mrs. Prescott, that you remember more than you're telling this jury? That you remember being angry at Rachel for trying to limit your access to your grandchildren? That you remember confronting her in her kitchen, picking up that candlestick, and... No, I didn't. I would never hurt those boys. They were my grandchildren, my blood. Rachel was the problem, not them. She was the one trying to take them away from me. The courtroom went silent. Eleanor seemed to realize what she had just said, implicitly acknowledging Rachel as the problem, while distancing herself from responsibility for the children's deaths. When Reyes concluded his direct examination, Prosecutor Reyes approached the witness stand for cross-examination. Mrs. Prescott, you've testified that you would never hurt your grandchildren. But the evidence shows that someone struck 9-year-old Mason 8 times with a heavy brass candlestick and struck 6-year-old Tyler 6 times, including wounds to his back while he tried to hide in a closet. If you didn't do this, who did? Eleanor's response was barely coherent. I don't know. I found them that way. There must have been someone else. Maybe someone followed Rachel home. I don't know. Despite no evidence of forced entry, despite no other DNA or fingerprints at the scene, despite your documented presence during the entire time frame when the murders occurred. Eleanor had no answer. Reyes concluded, "No further questions, Your Honor." Following Eleanor's devastating testimony, the defense called 2 character witnesses, a former colleague from Eleanor's school district and her longtime friend from church. Both testified to Eleanor's dedication to children's education and her devotion to her grandchildren, but neither had significant recent contact with her, and neither could speak to the family dynamics that had been established through other testimony. The defense's final witness was Dr. Thomas Chen, a psychiatrist specializing in trauma and memory. It's entirely possible for an individual to experience significant memory impairment surrounding traumatic events, Dr. Chen testified. The mind sometimes protects itself from unbearable experiences through dissociation or selective amnesia. Prosecutor Reyes' cross-examination was brief but effective. Dr. Chen, in your experience, is it common for individuals to forget traumatic actions they've committed,
while clearly remembering details that might support their innocence. The psychiatrist hesitated before acknowledging that such selective amnesia, while possible, raised questions about its authenticity. And isn't it also true that genuine traumatic amnesia typically affects memory of discovering trauma, not memory of perpetrating it? In other words, wouldn't Mrs. Prescott be more likely to forget finding her grandchildren dead than forget killing them if her amnesia were genuine? Dr. Chen's response was reluctant but honest. Yes, that pattern would be more consistent with genuine traumatic amnesia. With that, the defense rested its case. Judge Thompson scheduled closing arguments for the following morning. As the courtroom emptied, legal analysts noted that Eleanor's testimony had likely done more harm than good for her defense. Her selective memory, combined with her revealing outburst about Rachel being the problem, had reinforced rather than undermined the prosecution's narrative. The morning of closing arguments brought overflow crowds to the Multnomah County Courthouse. The rain that had marked the trial's opening had given way to pale autumn sunshine that did nothing to warm the somber mood inside courtroom 3A. Judge Thompson began by instructing the jury on the law, explaining the elements the prosecution needed to prove for first-degree murder, and outlining the lesser-included offenses of second-degree murder and manslaughter that jurors could consider as alternatives. Your verdict must be based on the evidence presented and the law as I have instructed you, Judge Thompson emphasized. You must not be swayed by sympathy, prejudice, or emotion for either side. Prosecutor Reyes approached the jury for his closing argument, his demeanor reflecting the gravity of the moment. Ladies and gentlemen, when this trial began, I promised to show you evidence that Eleanor Prescott made a deliberate decision to end 3 innocent lives, rather than accept that Rachel had the right to establish boundaries in her own home. Over the past week, the state has fulfilled that promise. Reyes methodically summarized the prosecution's case using a timeline displayed on the courtroom screen. Let's review what the evidence has established beyond any reasonable doubt. Security camera footage shows Eleanor Prescott arriving at the Thornton home at 2:47 p.m., when Rachel and her sons were already home. Rachel's fitness tracker recorded her heart stopping at 3:24 p.m. Eleanor remained at that house for over 3 hours before calling 911, during which time she attempted to wash away blood evidence, dispose of the murder weapon in a storm drain, and fabricate a false timeline of events. Reyes addressed the motive directly. The defendant's own words reveal her state of mind. She told her friend that Rachel didn't know who she was dealing with. She wrote that some battles have consequences that Rachel couldn't imagine. She searched online for how long it takes to die from head trauma. And then, when confronted in this courtroom, she revealed what this case has always been about. She called Rachel the problem, while insisting the boys weren't. Reyes's voice hardened. Eleanor Prescott viewed her grandchildren as her possessions and Rachel as an obstacle to her control over them. When Rachel convinced David to establish formal boundaries on Eleanor's visits, reasonable boundaries that any parent has the right to establish, Eleanor decided to eliminate the obstacle. That Rachel's children, Eleanor's own grandchildren, were killed in the process speaks to the depth of her rage and the completeness of her break from reality. Reyes addressed the defense's arguments directly. The defense has suggested that Mrs. Prescott was too frail to commit these crimes. Yet forensic evidence established that a 4-pound candlestick swung with momentum provides its own force, and that adrenaline in states of rage can provide remarkable strength. They've suggested early cognitive decline affected her judgment. Yet her calculated actions before and after the murders demonstrate clear strategic thinking. They've claimed traumatic amnesia explains her inconsistent statements, yet she remembers clearly what she thinks will help her defense, while conveniently forgetting everything that incriminates her. And they've implied some unknown intruder committed these crimes, yet there is no evidence of anyone else's presence, no forced entry, no foreign DNA, nothing but Eleanor Prescott's documented arrival, her documented presence throughout the relevant time frame, and her documented attempts to cover her tracks. Reyes moved closer to the jury, his voice lowering. Rachel Thornton was 38 years old. She was a pediatric nurse who dedicated her career to healing sick children. She was a mother who fought to protect her sons from a grandmother who saw them as possessions rather than people. She died fighting. The defensive wounds on her arms show she tried to protect herself, tried to survive for her boys. Mason Thornton was 9 years old. He loved soccer and wanted to be a veterinarian. He died trying to protect his little brother. The forensic evidence shows he positioned himself between the attacker and Tyler, trying to shield the brother he loved from the violence he somehow knew was coming. Tyler Thornton was 6 years old. He had just started kindergarten. He liked dinosaurs and building blocks. He died hiding in his closet, struck from behind as he tried to make himself small enough to disappear, to escape the nightmare that had invaded his home. Reyes paused, allowing these images to settle. The evidence in this case is overwhelming. It points to one conclusion and one conclusion only. Eleanor Prescott murdered Rachel, Mason, and Tyler Thornton. She did so deliberately, with premeditation, and with the calculated cruelty of someone who would rather destroy her family than lose control over it. He returned to the prosecution table. Justice for Rachel, Mason, and Tyler Thornton demands a verdict of guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. Nothing less, honors their memory, or holds their killer accountable.
Defense attorney O'Coffer approached the jury with measured steps, her tone conversational rather than confrontational. This has been an emotionally devastating case for everyone involved. Nothing I say is intended to minimize the tragedy of losing Rachel, Mason, and Tyler Thornton. Their deaths represent an incomprehensible loss. She paused, gathering herself. But our justice system requires more than tragedy and emotion to convict someone of first-degree murder. It requires proof beyond reasonable doubt, not suspicion, not probability, but certainty. And despite the prosecution's confident presentation, significant doubts remain. O'Coffer focused on the circumstantial nature of much of the evidence. No one saw Eleanor Prescott commit these crimes. No witness has testified to watching her strike Rachel or the boys. The prosecution has presented a timeline, forensic analysis, and communications they interpret as threatening, but interpretation is not the same as proof. She addressed the physical evidence, suggesting alternative explanations for Eleanor's fingerprints on the candlestick and the blood on her clothing. Eleanor Prescott gave that candlestick to David and Rachel as a wedding gift. She has handled it countless times over the years. Finding her fingerprints on it proves nothing about who used it as a weapon. And the blood on her clothing is consistent with someone who discovered a horrific crime scene and attempted to check on victims she loved, her daughter-in-law, her grandchildren. O'Coffer reminded the jury of the neurological testimony regarding frontal lobe changes and the expert testimony about traumatic amnesia. If Eleanor Prescott did experience some kind of break from reality on that afternoon, the question becomes whether she formed the specific intent, the premeditation that first-degree murder requires. A moment of rage, a dissociative episode. These might be criminal, but they are not first-degree murder. She concluded by appealing to the jury's sense of reasonable doubt. You have heard emotional testimony and seen disturbing evidence, but emotion is not proof. If you find yourself thinking she probably did it, or she most likely did it, remember that probably and most likely are not the standard. The standard is beyond reasonable doubt. And in this case, reasonable doubt exists. Prosecutor Reyes's rebuttal was brief but powerful. Defense counsel speaks of reasonable doubt, but doubt must be reasonable, not manufactured, not hypothetical. The evidence in this case is not merely circumstantial. Eleanor Prescott's fingerprints are on the murder weapon, in blood. Her clothing bears spatter that could only have been created during an active assault. Her communications reveal escalating hostility and explicit references to consequences. Her internet searches show someone contemplating exactly the method of death that killed Rachel and her children. And when confronted in this courtroom, Eleanor Prescott revealed her true mindset, calling Rachel the problem, while insisting her grandchildren weren't. That single statement tells you everything you need to know about her motive and her state of mind. Reyes faced the jury directly. 3 people are dead, a mother and her 2 young sons. The evidence tells you who killed them and why. The only question remaining is whether you will hold Eleanor Prescott accountable or allow her to escape justice because of her age and appearance. Rachel, Mason, and Tyler deserve better. They deserve justice. With closing arguments complete, Judge Thompson provided final instructions to the jury before they retired to deliberate at 11:17 a.m. The hours that followed were tense for everyone connected to the case. David Thornton waited in a private room, unable to sit still, walking endless circles while victim advocates monitored his well-being. The Kim family huddled together in another room, praying and weeping and hoping. Eleanor Prescott was returned to a holding cell, her composure reportedly cracking as she faced the possibility of conviction. Unlike many complex cases that result in extended deliberations, the jury requested to review only 2 pieces of evidence during their discussions: the security camera footage and Eleanor's communications with David in the weeks before the murders. By 4:45 p.m., less than 6 hours after beginning deliberations, they notified the court that they had reached a verdict. As court reconvened, the tension was overwhelming. Every seat was filled, spectators standing along the walls. David Thornton sat between Janet and Grace Kim, their hands linked as they awaited the words that would provide some measure of closure, or not. Eleanor Prescott was brought in, her earlier composed demeanor gone. She appeared diminished, her age more evident than at any point during the trial, her hands trembling visibly as she sat at the defense table. Judge Thompson called the court to order. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreperson, a middle-aged librarian named Margaret, stood. We have, Your Honor. The verdict forms were passed to the judge, who reviewed them silently before returning them to be read aloud. In the case of the State of Oregon versus Eleanor Prescott, on the count of murder in the first degree of Rachel Thornton, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty as charged. A soft sound went through the courtroom. Relief, grief, and vindication mingled together. On the count of murder in the first degree of Mason Thornton, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty as charged. On the count of murder in the first degree of Tyler Thornton, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty as charged. The Kim family collapsed into each other's arms, weeping. David Thornton sat motionless, his face blank with shock. Not surprise, but the particular numbness of having a nightmare officially confirmed as reality. Eleanor Prescott remained still for a long moment before turning to look at her son. Their eyes met across the courtroom. The mother who had murdered his wife and children, the son who had lost everything. Whatever passed between them in that look would remain known only to them. Judge Thompson thanked the jury for their service, and scheduled sentencing for November 30th, 3 weeks later. Court was adjourned. Outside the courthouse, the autumn evening had turned cold. Media representatives surrounded the families as they emerged, but victim advocates and court security created a barrier, allowing David and the Kims to reach their vehicles without having to speak. Prosecutor Reyes held a brief press conference, his statement measured despite the victory. Today's verdict holds Eleanor Prescott accountable for the murders of Rachel, Mason, and Tyler Cornton. While no verdict can bring them back or fully heal the wounds this tragedy has caused, we hope it provides some measure of justice and closure for their loved ones. Legal analysts noted the significance of the verdict as a case study in family violence perpetrated by an unlikely offender. This case will be studied for years, one commentator observed. It challenges our assumptions about who is capable of violence and reminds us that control and possessiveness can be just as dangerous as exhibited by a grandmother as by a spouse or partner. The warning signs were there, the boundary violations, the escalating intrusions, and the explicit references to consequences. But our cultural blind spots about elderly women prevented people from recognizing the danger until it was too late. The sentencing hearing for Eleanor Prescott took place on November 30th, 2023, with the courtroom once again packed to capacity. Oregon's abolition of the death penalty meant the maximum sentence was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But the hearing would provide an opportunity for impact statements and final words that would give voice to the full scope of the tragedy. Judge Thompson began by addressing the defendant. Mrs. Prescott, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of 3 counts of murder in the first degree of Rachel Thornton, Mason Thornton, and Tyler Thornton. Before I pronounce sentence, I will hear from family members of the victims who wish to make impact statements, followed by any statement you wish to make on your own behalf. Janet Kim, Rachel's mother, approached the podium first. She moved slowly, the weight of grief evident in every step. Rachel was our only daughter. We called her our miracle baby. We had tried for so long to have children, and when she finally came, she was everything we had hoped for and more. She was brilliant and kind and dedicated her life to helping children. When she became a mother herself, she put everything into raising Mason and Tyler to be thoughtful, loving people. Janet's voice broke, and she continued. I remember holding Mason when he was born, my first grandchild. I remember Tyler's first steps. I remember birthday parties and holiday dinners, and all the ordinary moments that you don't know are precious until they're gone forever. She turned to face Eleanor. You took all of that from us. Not because you were mentally ill, not because you had some uncontrollable impulse, but because you couldn't accept that you weren't in control of Rachel's family. You killed my daughter because she had the audacity to set boundaries. You killed your own grandchildren, children you claim to have loved, because in that moment they were just obstacles between you and what you wanted. Janet returned to her seat, and Grace Kim approached to deliver her statement. Rachel was my big sister, my best friend, my role model. Everything good about me I learned from her. She taught me how to stand up for myself, how to love unconditionally, how to find joy in helping others. Grace's composure cracked as she described the last conversation she'd had with Rachel. The morning she died, Rachel called me to talk about Thanksgiving plans. We were going to surprise our parents with a trip to Hawaii, the whole family together.
The whole family together for the first time in years. Mason was excited because he'd never seen the ocean. Tyler wanted to learn to surf. She wiped her eyes. That trip will never happen. Mason will never see the ocean. Tyler will never learn to surf. They'll never graduate from elementary school, never go to prom, never fall in love, never have children of their own. All of that future gone because Eleanor Prescott decided her access to those boys mattered more than their right to have a mother. Finally, David Thornton approached the podium. He stood for a long moment before speaking, as if gathering strength from some deep reserve.
I've spent the past 2.5 months trying to understand how this happened. How the woman who raised me, who taught me right from wrong, who attended every school event and bandaged every scraped knee, how she could do what she did. He looked at Eleanor, who would not meet his eyes. The truth is, the signs were there, and I didn't want to see them. Rachel tried to tell me. She said there was something wrong with how Mom treated her, how Mom talked about the boys like they belonged to her instead of to us. I made excuses. I told Rachel that Mom was just old-fashioned, just lonely, just having trouble adjusting. David's voice hardened. I was wrong. Rachel was right about everything. And my refusal to see the truth, to protect my wife and children from my own mother, I have to live with that. Every day, I wake up and remember that I gave Mom permission to visit that day. I told her it would be fine to stop by while I was out of town. I handed her the opportunity to kill my family. He turned back to the court. I don't want to hear my mother's voice ever again. I don't want her apologies or her explanations or her attempts to minimize what she did. She made her choice, and now I've made mine. I'm asking the court to impose the maximum sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Not because I want revenge, but because she cannot be trusted to ever be part of society again. David returned to his seat. The courtroom remained silent as Judge Thompson turned to the defendant. Mrs. Prescott, you have the right to make a statement before sentencing. Do you wish to speak? Eleanor rose slowly, her defense attorney beside her. When she spoke, her voice was thin but audible. I want to say, I don't fully remember what happened that day. I've gone over it and over it in my mind, and there are pieces missing. I know the evidence says I did these things, and I accept the jury's verdict, but I can't remember. She faltered, then continued. Rachel and I had our differences. I thought she was too permissive with the boys, too quick to dismiss traditional values. But I never wanted her dead. I never wanted to hurt my grandsons. They were the light of my life. Eleanor looked toward David, who stared straight ahead, refusing to meet his gaze. David, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know how this happened. I don't understand how I could have... She broke off, unable or unwilling to complete the confession. Judge Thompson waited a moment to ensure she was finished, then addressed the court. Eleanor Prescott, you have been found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence presented at trial established that you planned and executed the killing of your daughter-in-law, Rachel Thornton, and in the course of that attack, murdered your grandsons Mason and Tyler Thornton as well. The judge's voice was stern but measured. These crimes represent a profound betrayal of family trust. Rachel Thornton welcomed you into her home, allowed you access to her children, and tried for years to maintain a relationship with you despite your constant interference and criticism. She repaid that effort with courage, standing up for her right to raise her own children, and you repaid her courage with murder. Judge Thompson continued, his tone growing heavier. Mason and Tyler Thornton were innocent children who trusted you as their grandmother. They had no part in any conflict between you and their mother. They were not obstacles or possessions to be eliminated when they became inconvenient to your desires. They were human beings with their own hopes, dreams, and futures you destroyed. It is therefore the judgment of this court
that you be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole on each of the 3 counts of first-degree murder, sentences to run consecutively. You will be remanded to the custody of the Oregon Department of Corrections for the remainder of your natural life." Judge Thompson paused, then added, "May the victims of your crimes rest in peace, and may their loved ones find some measure of healing in the years ahead." Court is adjourned.
Eleanor Prescott was led from the courtroom by corrections officers, her steps shuffling, her earlier composure entirely gone. She did not look back at her son as she was taken away. David Thornton remained seated as the courtroom emptied around him, Janet and Grace Kim on either side. After several minutes, a victim advocate approached gently, and the 3 of them finally rose and left through a private exit. Outside the courthouse, Prosecutor Reyes addressed the media one final time. "Today's sentence ensures that Eleanor Prescott will spend the rest of her life in prison for the murders of Rachel, Mason, and Tyler Thornton. While no sentence can restore what was taken, we hope this conclusion provides some measure of closure for the Thornton and Kim families and sends a clear message that domestic violence and family abuse will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, regardless of the perpetrator's age or status." In the weeks and months that followed, the case continued to reverberate through legal and psychological communities. Domestic violence organizations cited it in training materials about recognizing controlling behavior in extended family relationships. Legal scholars analyzed the challenge of prosecuting elderly defendants for violent crimes. Mental health professionals discussed the case in the context of personality disorders and the dangerous escalation that can occur when controlling individuals face loss of access to those they view as possessions. David Thornton, after taking an extended leave from his pharmaceutical sales position, eventually quit entirely. He sold the house on Lakewood Drive, unable to live where his family had died, and moved to California to be closer to the Kim family, who had become his only remaining source of familial support. 6 months after the sentencing, David established the Thornton Family Foundation, dedicated to education about family violence warning signs and support services for families dealing with controlling or abusive extended relatives. Rachel tried to set boundaries, David explained in an interview marking the foundation's launch. "She did everything the experts tell you to do. She communicated clearly, she asked for support, she didn't escalate conflicts. And it wasn't enough, because the person she was dealing with didn't operate by normal rules. I want other families to know the warning signs Rachel saw, so they can protect themselves before it's too late." The foundation also established the Mason and Tyler Thornton Memorial Scholarship, providing funding for students pursuing careers in education or pediatric health care, fields that both reflected Rachel's profession and honored the futures her sons would never have. At Westside Elementary School, where Mason had been a student, his 3rd-grade classroom dedicated a reading corner in his memory, filled with books about animals and nature that he had loved. Tyler's kindergarten class planted a garden in the school courtyard, tending flowers that bloomed each spring in remembrance of the little boy who had never finished his first year of school. Eleanor Prescott was transferred to Coffee Creek Correctional Facility, Oregon's only women's prison, where she would spend the remainder of her life. Reports from the facility indicated she had difficulty adjusting to incarceration, frequently clashing with staff and other inmates over what she perceived as insufficient respect for her age and former status. She never received visitors. David refused all contact, and her few remaining friends from her previous life had distanced themselves after the trial. Her letters to David were returned unopened. Her attempts to contact the Kim family through attorneys were firmly rebuffed. 18 months after her incarceration began, Eleanor Prescott suffered a massive stroke in her cell. She was transported to a medical facility, where she died 3 days later without regaining consciousness. She was 73 years old. News of her death was reported briefly in Oregon media,
noted as the conclusion of a case that had shocked the Pacific Northwest. David Thornton, when reached for comment, issued a single statement through his attorney. Eleanor Prescott's death does not bring me peace. It does not bring back Rachel, Mason, or Tyler. It does not undo the damage she caused to so many lives. My focus remains on honoring my family's memory through the Foundation's work and helping other families recognize and escape the kind of toxic control that destroyed mine. Eleanor was buried in a small cemetery outside Portland, her grave marked only with her name and dates. No mention of her former career, her family, or the crimes that had ended her life as a free woman. David did not attend the burial. No one did. The house on Lakewood Drive was eventually sold to a young family who knew nothing of its history. The new owners repainted the walls, replaced the flooring, and filled the rooms with their own laughter and memories, gradually erasing the physical traces of the tragedy that had occurred there. But for those who had known Rachel, Mason, and Tyler, the memories persisted. Each September 14th, the anniversary of their deaths, small gatherings took place. At the Memorial Garden, at the school library, at a quiet stretch of California beach where David now lived. Rachel's colleagues from Emmanuel Children's Hospital gathered each year to share stories about their friend, the pediatric nurse who had brought comfort to countless sick children and their families. Mason's former classmates, growing older each year, returned to the reading corner that bore his name. And Tyler, often accompanied by Janet and Grace, would visit a memorial plaque installed at a Portland park, bearing 3 names and the words, "Beloved, missed, forever in our hearts." The case of Oregon versus Prescott became a landmark in the study of family violence, cited in academic papers and legal proceedings across the country. It challenged assumptions about who could perpetrate domestic abuse and forced a reconsideration of how society perceives elderly individuals, not as uniformly harmless and vulnerable, but as complex humans capable of the same range of behavior, including violence, as any other demographic. Most importantly, the case served as a stark reminder that the most dangerous predators don't always look dangerous. Sometimes they look like grandmothers who bake cookies and attend school plays. Sometimes they present as devoted family members whose love has curdled into possession. And sometimes the warning signs that could save lives go unheeded because society refuses to believe that someone who looks so harmless could be capable of such harm. Rachel Thornton had seen the warning signs. She had tried to protect her family. She set boundaries, communicated her fears, sought support from her husband and sister. She did everything she was supposed to do, and it wasn't enough because the person she was dealing with was someone no one wanted to believe capable of violence. In the end, Rachel's legacy was not defined by her death, but by the lives she had touched, the children she had helped heal as a nurse, the students she had inspired through her warmth and dedication, the family that she had loved with her whole heart. Mason's legacy was the reading corner filled with adventure stories, the memory of a boy who tried to protect his brother even in his final moments. Tyler's legacy was the garden that bloomed each spring, a reminder of innocence lost but not forgotten. And David Thornton's legacy would be the foundation bearing his family's name, working to ensure that other families would recognize the danger signs he had missed, that other Rachels would be believed when they expressed fear, that other Masons and Tylers would be protected from those who viewed them as possessions rather than people. The Lakewood betrayal, as the case became known in media coverage and true crime discussions, would be remembered as more than a shocking murder case. It would be remembered as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ignoring warning signs, the importance of believing victims who express fear, and the devastating consequences that can result when controlling behavior is excused or minimized because of the perpetrator's age, status, or relationship to the victims. As one domestic violence advocate observed in a documentary about the case,
Eleanor Prescott didn't become dangerous overnight. The warning signs were there for years. The boundary violations, the undermining of Rachel's authority, the possessive language about her grandsons. People saw these behaviors and dismissed them as annoying but harmless. That's just how she is, they said. She means well. But controlling behavior is never harmless. It's always a warning sign. And when we ignore those warnings, sometimes people die. The documentary concluded with footage from the Thornton Family Foundation's annual memorial event, showing David Thornton speaking to an audience of domestic violence survivors, advocates, and family members. "Rachel deserved to be believed," David said, his voice steady but emotional. "She told me she was afraid, and I didn't take it seriously. Mason and Tyler deserved to be protected, and I failed them. I can't change what happened to my family, but I can honor their memory by helping others avoid the same fate." If you're watching this and you recognize your situation in Rachel's story, if someone in your family exhibits the kind of controlling, possessive behavior my mother showed, please take it seriously. Don't make the excuses I made. Don't tell yourself it's not that bad or that the person means well. Trust your instincts. Seek help. Protect yourself and your children.
He paused, collecting himself before concluding. And if you're the person exhibiting those behaviors, if you find yourself unable to accept boundaries, if you view family members as extensions of yourself rather than independent people, if you feel entitled to access and control that hasn't been freely given, please seek help. Talk to a therapist. Examine why you need to control others to feel secure. Because if you don't address these patterns, they will escalate, and the consequences will be devastating, not just for your family, but for you. The screen faded to black, then to images of Rachel, Mason, and Tyler, smiling in family photos, playing in their backyard, celebrating birthdays with cake and candles, and the innocent belief that tomorrow would always come. For them, tomorrow never came. But in their memory, through the Foundation's work and the awareness their case generated, other tomorrows were being protected, other families were learning to recognize danger, other victims were being believed. It was not enough. It could never be enough to balance the scales against 3 lives lost, but it was something, a legacy of hope built from tragedy, a light kindled from the darkest possible circumstances. And in that light, Rachel, Mason, and Tyler Thornton would be remembered not for how they died, but for who they were. A mother who fought for her children, a boy who protected his brother, and a little one who never got to see the ocean. Their story ended on a September afternoon in Portland, Oregon, behind the closed doors of a house on Lakewood Drive. But the echoes of that story continue to resonate, warning us to see what we don't want to see, believe what we don't want to believe, and protect those we love from dangers that don't always look dangerous. Because sometimes the call is coming from inside the house. Sometimes the threat is sitting at the dinner table. And sometimes the greatest danger wears the face of someone who claims to love you. The Lakewood betrayal reminds us that family violence doesn't discriminate by age, gender, or social status. It can emerge from anyone whose need for control outweighs their capacity for love. And until we learn to recognize those patterns for what they are, regardless of how the perpetrator presents themselves, tragedies like the deaths of Rachel, Mason, and Tyler Thornton will continue to occur. May their memory be a blessing. May their story be a warning. And may we all have the courage to believe the Rachels in our lives before it's too late. If you or someone you know is experiencing family violence or controlling behavior from a family member,
please contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Help is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Trust your instincts. You deserve to be believed.